In a grand ballroom in Paris in 1737, a skillful flute player enamors the audience with his song. It seems like an ordinary concert, familiar, and yet something is strange. The flute is played not by a human, but by an automaton. The automaton flute player simulates a musician's finger and lip movement, and even the intricate breath control required to play the instrument. It wasn't just that the machine played music, but that it imitated human behavior that made it strange. This eerie sense of a human machine, along with the automaton's life-size appearance, blurred the boundaries between the technological and the human, creating an experience that many would call uncanny. I'm your host, Donna Honarpisheh, and this is ICA Miami's Tomorrow is the Problem. We've dedicated this season to exploring the uncanny. In this episode, we're going to begin our conversation with media scholar Jeffrey Sconce to learn about the relationship between the uncanny and electronic communication technology. Then we'll sit down with multimedia artist Tony Oursler, whose art attunes the viewer to the experiential effects of technology.
The uncanny means a lot of things.
This is Jeffrey Sconce, a film professor at Northwestern and author of the book Haunted Media: Electronic Presence from Telegraphy to Television. The concept of the uncanny was first explored by German psychiatrist Ernst Anton Jentsch in his 1906 essay on the psychology of the uncanny. Of course, Jentsch didn't use the word uncanny. He used the German unheimlich.
I would say in the humanities, in the most kind of popular way of defining it, the uncanny is just that kind of sense of eeriness or strangeness or estrangement, defamiliarization that one feels sometimes just out of the blue. Something just happens that just kind of makes the hairs on the back of your neck stick up.
13 years later, Freud expanded on Jentsch's work with an essay of his own, The Uncanny. The uncanny begins by dissecting the word unheimlich. Just like the English, the prefix un means not. Unable means not able. Unbearable means not bearable. Heimlich refers to that which is secret, hidden, or withheld. It can also mean homey or familiar. So unheimlich, or uncanny, includes the dialectical meaning of something that is at once familiar and unfamiliar.
Freud famously talks about, certain objects that can create an uncanny feeling. Dolls, wax mannequins, and so forth. But then he also talks about things like coincidences. Sometimes when something is just a real coincidence, you have that kind of weird feeling that there's some other logic at work there. Or manifestations of insanity, seeing somebody who is delusional or hallucinating or acting in some very altered way can seem very uncanny as well. The meaning of the uncanny that Freud inherits before he writes this essay is sort of a confusion between animate and inanimate objects, and anything that blurs that line.
Electronic communication, telegrams, email, radio, phones, television, embodies that blurred line between the inanimate and animate. It creates never-fading echoes of our personhood, our image, our voice, and separates them from our bodies. With technological developments, the sense of the uncanny has shifted, but it continues to be a significant part of how we experience society, and the strange yet familiar within it. It also has a long history tied to questions of technology, the paranormal, and ghosts. Here's video artist Tony Oursler, who shares just how common these things are within our supposed rational society.
Paranormal is, in fact, if you look at statistically, probably 1/4 of the population believes in ghosts. More than half of the population believes in mental telepathy. And a large bit of the population also believes in alien life. And so the paranormal index is firmly entrenched in American culture. So it's become my subject matter.
Even though we've fully integrated electronic communication into our daily lives, it's safe to say we're still not entirely comfortable with these technologies. Plenty of people find phone calls uncomfortable or feel anxious before shooting an email. During the pandemic, it became clear that nobody wanted to have video calls with their cameras on. There's an unease between us and electronic communication that goes back to the advent of the telegraph.
The argument could be made that almost all of the communication technologies that we live with today have a certain uncanny element to them, even though we're very much habituated in using them. The very fact that, we can kind of strip our consciousness away from our mind and transport it through wires and through wireless to other parts of the world, that there is something just inherently uncanny about that. My historical work was looking at people like the early spiritualist movement, who sort of recognized in the telegraph that just the very fact that you could send dots and dashes around the world and encode somebody's thoughts in New York and decode them in London, within seconds, that's just fundamentally uncanny, right? There's something just kind of marvelous, but also kind of unnerving about that.
In the 1840s, sending a letter across the Atlantic took at least 6 weeks. And then, practically overnight, we could talk to each other across thousands of miles almost in real time. Take a moment and try to imagine how strange that would be for someone living at that time. I want to get into some of your work in haunted media and how it opens with a description of how the invention of the telegraph emerged as a force of disruption that altered the relationship to daily life. So for our listeners, could you describe this moment in history?
Sure. There was a kind of an interesting historical conjuncture in the 1840s where Samuel Morse, who we know from Morse code and is typically credited as the inventor of the telegraph, debuts the first electromagnetic telegraph in 1848, sends a message between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Around that same time, there's all sorts of kind of splinter, factionalized new religious groups, most of them in upstate New York, who are exploring new versions of Christianity, a new, more kind of American democratic form of Christianity. And there's this famous story of 2 little girls living in Hydesville, New York, who were basically playing pranks on their parents by making noises, little cracking noises in the bed at night. But from this, there was this idea that there were spirits talking to them, and the girls themselves didn't develop this theory, but people around them who were trying to explain how these girls were suddenly able to channel spirits or talk to people from the other side came to believe in this thing called the spiritual telegraph. And they looked at what Morse had done in the real world, the material world, and speculated that people in the afterlife, like Benjamin Franklin and Shakespeare and Socrates and other intellectuals, had devised a technology in the other world that allowed them to communicate with us through mediums, seances, channeling, all the terminology that we associate with that.
The advent of the telegraph coincided with the rise of spiritualism, a belief system that revolves around the idea that the living can speak with the dead. However, its members might have been hesitant to categorize spiritualism as a religious movement. Rather than relying on faith, spiritualism appropriates scientific language to prop up its claims. To them, this was just another advancement in mass communication or media.
Samuel Morse's telegraph provided a profound philosophical tool to rethink how space and time do work or could work. And, the early spiritualists, the folks that were trying to theorize what they think is happening with these people who claim they can contact the other side, that the telegraph was the most available, somewhere between a metaphor and a literal technology. And that's what I find interesting about the very earliest phase of spiritualism, were the people who were saying, no, this is a literal technology that has been developed by people. There is a spiritual analog to the telegraph, versus those who decided to see it more as a metaphor, a way of thinking about how consciousness and the body could be split and divided from each other and transmitted. But what's interesting about that association between spirits and technology is how it changes from period to period.
For example, the tone of seances changed dramatically from their inception to the present day. At their start, they weren't spooky affairs, quite the opposite.
The original spiritualists, one thing I would say about them is I don't really think they experienced it as uncanny in the Freudian sense, right? Because their approach to it was that this was this marvelous revelation that had been made to them, and they very eagerly wanted to be in contact with the spirits, a sense of excitement more than dread, really, and not eeriness as much as, again, kind of elation that you associate with a lot of religious states of exaltation at making contact with the spirits. I would say the technology gets more uncanny when we get to radio, because then when we get to wireless and radio at the turn of the century, this idea that consciousness and voices are just out there in the atmosphere, no longer bound from point to point by a cable, but just loose out in the ether, that there was something fundamentally more uncanny about that. And also linked to the historical period where people are thinking about the dimensions of the world they live in, this kind of huge global envelope of energy that surrounds them, and the idea that one could get lost in that or have their consciousness kind of evaporate or fade away in much the same way that when you're trying to tune in a radio station and can't get it, there might be a similar thing going on there with spirits and the afterlife. I should say even with the spiritual telegraph, even though it was a mystical spiritual technology, the way they conceptualized it as the medium at the seance as a literal flesh and blood terminal that could then, through a cable of sorts, contact the afterlife, that they still saw that as a physical bonding through the technology. Whereas wireless, I still think wireless is the spookiest of all the technologies, because I think we don't think about it much, but the idea that wherever we are, there are thousands and thousands of potential voices that could be activated through our technologies just by turning them on, and that they're all silently with us and around us all the time, to me is a profoundly uncanny phenomenon.
Perhaps because of its scientific branding, spiritualism drew in a variety of scientists and supposed rationalists. Renowned chemist Sir William Crookes became president of the Society for Psychical Research. In an interview with Forbes, Thomas Edison revealed that, quote, "I have been at work for some time building an apparatus to see if it is possible for personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us," end quote. A device he called a spirit phone. Perhaps most famously, Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes and advocate for rationality, was a member of the Ghost Club and attended multiple seances. It's easy to poke fun at these people for succumbing to pseudoscience, especially when you learn about some of the stranger beliefs, such as the idea that women have a negative electrical charge that attract ghosts. But their desire to connect to the dead is deeply human. Moreover, the telegraph allows you to interact with a person who is not in the room with you. It cleaves the mind from the body, allowing someone's consciousness, essentially, to travel through cables and wires. If consciousness can exist outside of the body in life, why can't it exist outside of the body after death?
Well, I would say it's the fundamental lesson of all electronic communications technology was this sense of liveness and presence, and yet a body and consciousness that were no longer necessarily aligned. So you could say, well, if you write a letter to somebody, which obviously people have been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, your thoughts and sentiments are in the letter, but there isn't that sense of live co-presence or coexistence between the message and the sender and the receiver. With the telegraph and then going into radio and television, there's always that sense that you're in live contact with some other entity, but it's not there, right? It's emanating from someplace else. And that's sort of been the uncanny effect of media since the telegraph onwards, is that sense of a living presence that one is interacting with, and yet the actual physical embodied person is not there.
This distortion of personhood through communication can cause some people to anthropomorphize the methods of communication themselves. In Jeffrey's book, Haunted Media, he explores incidents in fiction and real life where people begin to suspect that their TVs and radios may have a life of their own.
Because electronic media seem to contain what seems like the spark of consciousness at some level, there has been a real tendency to sort of anthropomorphize them or to see them as capable of sustaining actual life. Television. There's a fantastic movie from the mid-50s called The Twonky, which is about a television that sprouts legs and starts walking around the house and getting into all kinds of mayhem. And it's a comedy, obviously, but it's also playing on that sense of, especially among early adopters of television, just what is this thing that's in the house that, brings images from around the world, is incessantly talking at you.
Television is a form of mass electronic communication that, as Jeffrey points out, lends itself to an erasure of boundaries between audience and content. It feels more personal than film, in part because of the longevity of its programs. Many of us have a show we watch for multiple years. Or because of the lack of a fourth wall. People on TV frequently talk to the viewer. Commercials.
For a limited time, you could try for 14 days. Pay just $19.95 plus shipping and handling.
The news.
Local news.
You're listening to 103.7 The Hawk. It's currently 62 degrees.
And children's television, especially children's television.
Okay, class, who would like to do problem 3 on the board?
All directly address the audience. But there's something else too. TV, even when it doesn't break the fourth wall, has a way of just sucking you in. You tune out the rest of the world, and the image on the screen just gets bigger and bigger in your mind's eye. When you remember a TV show, you don't remember actually watching it. In your mind's eye, you don't see the actual television or the surroundings of your living room. You just remember what was on the screen itself. The immersion isn't necessarily a bad thing. TV offers a comfort that few other mediums can provide.
Sometimes with my students, I ask them to remember the first time they were left alone in the house by their parents, right? That they were considered to be old enough to be alone. And they'll remember it. And I'll say, now, were you frightened? And a lot of them will say, yeah, I remember kind of being scared and whatever else. And I ask them, well, what did you do to make yourself not feel frightened? And inevitably they'll say they turned on the television set, right? And I will ask them, well, what did you think the television set was going to do for you? Was it going to keep monsters out of the house? Was it going to keep a serial killer from crawling in the window? And, they will all say, well, it was that sense of living, contact, that there's somehow a sense that I'm in contact with the larger world, even though intellectually you would know you're not, that it is a unidirectional signal coming into your house. But there's still that comfort of feeling like you're with a living presence. And then in the thought experiment to say, would you get the same effect if you took a Bell & Howell 16 millimeter projector out of the closet and projected movies on the wall? Would that give you that same sense of comfort? And no, it wouldn't, I don't think, right? But the television does. And I think the uncanniness of the projection, what's comforting as a child maybe, to have that living connection, can be made strange through the projections that Tony does because they do have that sense of a living electronic kind of presence in them.
The Tony Jeffrey mentions here is Tony Oursler. Oursler is a multimedia and installation artist whose conceptual practice combines traditional art-making tools with new technologies. His work consistently draws from a range of pop cultural phenomena, including telecommunications, conspiracy, social media, facial recognition, mysticism, and environmental concerns. He began his career as a student at Cal Arts.
I'm going to digress really rapidly here into how California Institute for the Arts was different than the average art place, because it was designed actually by Walt Disney architecturally and funded by him. And he had this idea that, his workshop that he had for making Disneyland and all of his films and so forth, he noticed that creative people kind of zigzagged through the culture. They started in one job and then they moved to another and another. And so somebody who was good at lighting might find out that they were actually much better at sound effects, and somebody who was interested in painting backgrounds or something, it would turn out that they were good at kind of motion graphics or something. And so he designed Cal Arts in such a way that the student body had to move through the space and be exposed to all the different arts. So, to get to your studio or to classes or so forth, you move past everything, and so there was this idea that you would be subliminally or overtly exposed to all the arts, and it would kind of help progress your evolution as an artist. And being a confused young person, completely naive, I just loved it. It was a great scene. Cal Arts at the time, you could imagine, was very experimental. People like John Cage had been there and was there, actually, somebody that I studied with. Nam June Paik, he was not actually there when I was at the school, but he came to lecture somewhere nearby, and we went to see him because we knew about him because he had left a video synthesizer in the school, and I had taken a class with that, and I had seen his tapes and so forth. And people like Jonathan Borofsky were there doing absolutely beautiful and disturbing projects about his dreams. I mean, I could keep going and going on Cal Arts stories.
Oursler's contemporaries, like Nam June Paik, were also pioneers in video art. Oursler's work, however, stands out due to his commitment towards erasing the frame, or, in other words, immersing the audience into the screen.
At Cal Arts, I was painting and drawing, and something seemed to be missing. And one of my professors suggested that I pick up a video camera. And I had never seen a video camera, so this gives you an idea about how long ago that was. And there were these things called Portapacks that were actually came out in 1967. It was the first way to do any kind of portable video. So I'd never even seen one of those functioning. And they were already 10 years old when I got them, roughly, and kind of burn out. But it opened up my mind. It's sort of, I was at what you call the TV generation. My generation watched more television than they did anything else except sleep.
The TV Tony grew up with was very campy. Star Trek, The Munsters, The Andy Griffith Show, Bewitched. The content of these shows skewed optimistic. Most storylines were wrapped up within each episode.
On the one hand, I was interested in making images and popular culture and so forth, and studying pop artists and surrealism. And on the other hand, I was a, member of this kind of virtual space, this kind of legions of people who grew up in this kind of ether of television land. And that's where the kind of power was, in a sense. And picking up the video camera, I was able to, in a way, pierce the veil, and go through to see the other side and to see how the camera made images, et cetera, and how they functioned in space. And so I began to play with things that could be done in my studio, that like painting sort of turned into sets and props and things like that. And then those were sort of turned inside out and displayed with videos. And so there was this kind of cycle back and forth between the medium of video. And of course, this was all black and white video. You could imagine how strange that looked. There were kind of trails inherent in the video because the technology was primordial, to say the least. Ghosty. From there on, I made videotapes and, as I mentioned, this kind of turning things inside out, where things would end up on the screen, but they would also be props, they would be performance. I would make sound effects and music and so forth. So it actually quickly evolved into what became the nascent field of installation, I guess, without really knowing it. And that's how I began. I was using a lot of very simple materials, paper, cardboard, cheap paint like tempera paint, and making things very rapidly and seeing how they transformed on the TV like that.
Typically, television does not want you to realize its immersive quality. Tony was very attuned to the uncanny qualities of the technology that surrounded him, and he began to play with ways to reveal the uncanny within the medium, first by exploring audiences' empathy towards the characters.
First videos I was making was really, they were really about attention span and perception, and in a way they were pushing what I discovered or thought about television, which was so strange, was that there was this kind of hypnagogic box, a kind of very small screen in relation to real life figures. And everybody quickly went into this kind of state of willing suspension of disbelief, this kind of tunnel vision inherent in viewing television. And when you do that, scale changes, So I was fascinated by the idea that people could really imagine themselves in the picture or part of the picture, and that these small figures that you saw on the screen, they were kind of, free floating. Once they got into your imagination, they were no longer these little gray pixels or approximations of reality. They were believable. And that is known as willing suspension of disbelief, or I thought of it as some kind of mimetic technology, so that it mimicked your imagination. I did these very comedic things where I would have these small characters appearing, sometimes really small, and I would play with the idea about kind of empathy, how people would relate to a doll on screen or these kind of small cardboard things, and imbue them with character and see how far I could stretch this willing suspension of disbelief, and at the same time playing with these narrative cliches of television.
Look at me.
Oursler kept finding new ways for audiences to connect to audiovisual content. He began with characters and merchandise from popular franchises, and then tried to subvert the ways audiences could connect to those images. He also focused on creating an immersive environment. Instead of a traditional viewing experience, where there is a screen on one wall and the audience sits across from it, Oursler placed multiple screens throughout his exhibition, often in unusual places. The audience can roam freely throughout the space, controlling their own distance from the screen.
I quickly was kind of disgusted by the idea that we were locked into a box. If you wanted that power of the moving image, that you had this frame around it that was designed in Japan or wherever it was that the televisions were made. And so the box was very apparent, that you were trapped in the box. And so I did everything I could do to kind of break that up with installation. I began to use reflections in water and mirrors and glass actually to do my installations. So I would take the power out of the screen and let it move onto these other surfaces.
Oursler used this technique in his piece L7, L5. L5 is a Lagrange point, a position between the Earth and Sun or the Earth and Moon, where an object will retain a perfect orbit. L7 is slang for a square, somebody who's out of touch. A fan of literary science fiction, Oursler found himself frustrated by how Hollywood didn't fully take advantage of the genre.
I was thinking a lot about science fiction and the difference between the way science fiction has been treated in books and films. Spielberg had and also Star Wars, these kind of cowboys and Indians in outer space effect. And I thought it was a really degraded form in a sense of something that had once been very imaginative and almost philosophical, pop philosophical early science fiction. But, the way that Hollywood was treating this idea of space was really wrong in some way. And so I had this idea that I would counterpoint that with people who actually had met aliens and actually had been involved with outer space in various ways.
Oursler wanted to contrast the more formulaic, tame science fiction stories of Hollywood with more bizarre narratives.
So I took a newspaper ad out in the Village Voice and invited people to come and tell me their firsthand accounts of meeting aliens. And I got actually one really great person who would only go by the name of Gloria, who came to my studio and talked about how she met aliens quite frequently who came in through her window at night and took her blood and did different things to her and talked to her and scared her, etc. And kind of juxtaposed that with this store-bought toys and marketing items from Star Wars, and like that. But in that particular piece, I took Gloria and reflected her into this kind of broken glass structure, which floated above a television about head height in the space at the kitchen.
The illusion created by reflecting an image in glass is called Pepper's ghost. Because glass is clear, the reflected image is semi-transparent, giving it a ghostly quality. Disney employs this technique to create phantasms in both the Haunted Mansion and the Tower of Terror.
You are about to discover what lies beyond the fifth dimension, beyond the deepest, darkest corner of the imagination, in the Tower of Terror.
I didn't get to see L7, L5. There aren't photos or recordings of the exhibition, but artist and writer Constance DeYoung describes the final installation like this.
Seeing this installation set off a chain reaction, a host of divergent considerations. It might be called seeing at first sight, this unexpected cropping up which in all its diversity seemed to spring into being all at once. If there is anything to designate in the first place, it's the place where seeing begins, in the dark. According to the artist, there's a reference being made here to domestic darkness, to houses and rooms where the night is lit by television. In the installation room, maybe it is night. All is definitely dark, and the only light is the kind only a television emits. Yet gone are the TV sets, the monitors. Television is all around and nowhere to be seen, not directly, not on the familiar rectangle, not as anything except reflected light, images let loose. They're released onto tinfoil, tinted water, pieces of broken glass. It's on these unvalued, everyday materials that Oursler's video images play. Materials turned respectively into a colony of stars, a miniature lake, a glass house, each of which is a local viewing site, illuminating an otherwise darkened scene.
After L7, L5, Oursler continued to experiment with projection. Projection art goes back tens of thousands of years. Potentially, cavemen were creating shadow puppets with their hands. Ancient philosophers from Greece and China mention camera obscuras, a form of projection where light passes through a small opening into a dark space and creates an upside-down image of the outside world. Film, if seen in theater, is projected onto a screen. And in the late 20th century, those film projectors became smaller, more affordable, and digital, which meant that Oursler could use them for his own work.
As I was fooling around with this little video projector, which I got in the mail, I quickly realized that I could combine it with these sort of fabric figures that I was making, these very loose kind of surveillance scarecrows, and give them a visage, and immediately changed the way I was going to work because they had this very strong effect on the viewer. The first one I made was like a little wedding doll that I had that was, maybe 12 inches tall with a blanked out face. So I immediately started projecting my face, so the first one was my face onto the wedding doll. I had a face on this small little wedding doll in my kitchen in Franklin Park, Boston, with my friend Joe Gibbons, and I was looking at it and I thought, oh, this is interesting. This was a real aha moment for me at that time in my life. And before, this was the ultimate uncanny for me, because it allowed me to take this impulse that I had of kind of removing the power of video from the box and to put it into a physical space. So this miniature projector was really radical for me. And so it allowed me to kind of start projecting on objects. And first I kind of thought of these as characters that came out of media space into physical space. And this was incredibly dynamic for me because I could write scripts and have them speak, and it was sort of like this endless cast of characters that came out of, that could have been in a film or a play or a movie or something, and now here they are in some sort of a space. Whether it was a art gallery or outside. I experimented with, making guard booths and all sorts of different things.
These uncanny projections of faces or parts of faces onto sculptures have become Oursler's calling card of sorts. Sometimes he projects only facial features. He had a rather famous series called Eyes, where he projected footage of eyes onto spherical sculptures. In the iris of the eyes, you see the reflection of a screen the model was looking at. His workstation features a projection sculpture about the height of an armchair of a face without a nose. It's not dissimilar to the Snapchat filter that would come out a decade later, the one where your eyes and lips become huge. David Bowie actually collaborated with Oursler to create ragdoll projection sculptures for the Where Are We Now music video.
My name's David Bowie.
Where we all think the same thoughts, unified mirror mind. Magic, same time.
Influence Machine, perhaps one of Oursler's most ambitious projects, relied on outdoor projections. Oursler found inspiration for the piece by researching seances.
I had this mass of information about mimetic technology, and I was trying to figure out how to unify that in a way that people could understand these connections today. And the way I was able to do it was I stumbled upon this idea of speaking to the dead through technology. There was Jeffrey Sconce's book, haunted media that came out around the same time I was working on that. And he lays it out really in a fantastic way. And I had sort of stumbled on the same thing because I knew about the spiritualists in upstate New York and their connection to the telegraph. So there's something about that collapsing of the space which is very important, and that happened with the telegraph. Every time there's a new technology that comes along, it could be seen almost as magic. But there's always an interesting point where people just don't know what to do with the new technology, and it hasn't been economically codified yet. So there's a kind of very open moment, and that moment often gets filled by this impulse to speak with the other side and with a kind of oracle impulse. And it's happened over and over. And I noticed you could take pretty much any new technology, mimetic technology like photography, sound recording.
Partly cloudy.
The telegraph, which was telecommunications, the film camera, the video, and even the computer. You can find examples of the possessed hard drive.
But it's not the whole thing goes up in smoke. You are good. Look around you.
Progress doesn't change our predisposition to believe in the supernatural or otherworldly. Far from it. There's something in us that wants to believe in the fantastical. For my generation, I remember the email chains you had to forward to 7 people or else you might be cursed forever. Each new invention Oursler realized inspired us to return to our oldest impulse, communing with the dead. Historical narratives tend to expunge these kinds of stories. Scientific advancement has historically been presented as rational, trustworthy, steady ascension towards enlightenment. But Oursler wanted to create a piece that highlighted that messier side of that narrative. He took the name influencing machine from an 18th century invention by Francis Hauksbee that toes the line between science and pseudoscience.
The piece was called The Influence Machine, which was based on this kind of fantastic pre-television invention, which was just a glass sphere which was vacuumed out and some gases put into it. And that sphere could be rubbed and it would start to glow. And you can see, if you look at technology and you know something about early video tubes and X-ray tubes, this is a precursor to the X-ray and the video and the cathode ray tube, but it had no actual function.
Francis Hauksbee essentially discovered the gas discharge lamp. Hauksbee filled the sphere with mercury, which creates light when interacting with static electricity, the kind of static electricity you can create with your hand. This all happened in the year 1705, over nearly 2 centuries before Edison patented the light bulb. This was a massive step forward to our understanding of how gas and electricity worked. But this was treated as a supernatural marvel rather than a scientific one.
You can't see from the light going.
The influencing machine was displayed as a novelty at fairs. People could pay to interact with the influencing machine and stare into its odd glow.
People just tried to imagine what it could do, and they projected all these mental ideas onto it, that it could help us reproduce, it could connect us with other worlds, it would glow in the dark, and so people were attracted to it. And I thought that would be a great a name for the piece.
Tony also took the name from psychoanalyst Victor Tausk's paper on the origin of the influencing machine in schizophrenia. In the paper, he describes a delusion in which patients believed that they were under the control of a secret machine. Tony continued his research in Lilydale, New York, where he visited a spiritual community that actively spoke to the dead. He compared their practices to the practice of spiritualists in the 19th century.
I was able to take what I learned from this history, this kind of Gothic history of speaking to the dead, and I wanted to play around with that. So I pulled some images from that. In fact, smoke projections from the Phantasmagoria, from Robertson's Phantasmagoria, and Konstantin Rudive's noise recordings of spirits from other dimensions, and possessed hard drives where I took scrambled text from possessed hard drives and projected them into spaces, and then projected faces onto trees, smoke, buildings, and so forth, and had them panning around in a park at night. And so the piece was meant to be on the edge of a natural space, which would be some kind of park or forest, and a city space. So there were projections on buildings, but next to parks. And so that was an important piece for me. I've continued working in that fashion over the years, and you could walk around the park and hear and see the images moving around. It had a kind of talking light as well, which was connected to the internet, so people could contribute to text to it. So it had a kind of interactive quality to it as well. And that was in 2000. And Tony Conrad did the soundtrack, and we collaborated on parts of it using the glass harmonica and some chanting.
Against this soundtrack, footage of heads are projected onto the branches of trees or against smoke. They represent historical figures such as Philo T. Farnsworth, the man who invented television, and Kate Fox of the infamous Fox sister mediums. They each perform a monologue. The leaves give an unusual texture to their skin, and the borders of the tree and fog don't match the borders of the human head. So many of the floating heads lack ears, parts of their forehead, or jaw. The colors are wrong, either due to editing the color balance or as a result of projecting onto natural surfaces. The faces take on tones of blue, green, and white. These disembodied heads move, some spin, some float across the night sky.
I look and look for answers before I have questions.
It's uncanny, yes, and also captivating. Oursler expands video beyond the frame of the TV screen and creates a more experiential landscape that pulls the viewer to think not only about what is seen and heard, but the experiences of dread and desire that manifest from this experience. Last question is, do you believe in ghosts? Or the afterlife, or the supernatural?
I've been very neutral on it. I've had some evidence of kind of supernatural experiences, but really I think of art as the supernatural. Art is my religion, because you take disparate elements and put them together, things, raw materials that get transformed into something that's beyond the sum of their parts. And for me, that's very magical, to the point of supernatural and, alchemic in a sense. So, art is my religion. I encourage everybody to make things. I really think that everybody should have, I hate this term, but a practice one way or the other to make something, and that there's many unseen benefits, seen and unseen benefits to that.
For Oursler, the uncanny is a space where contradictions thrive. Things are living and not living. They're beautiful and ugly, artificial and real all at once. Within that blurred line, Oursler finds ways to challenge our assumptions about how we connect to technology and to each other. His distorted faces and projection ragdolls test the levels of our empathy. What makes us recognize something as human or not human? L7, L5 dares its audience to ask more of science fiction, to imagine worlds beyond Earth, people beyond humans. He resists neat formulas and traditional modes of media consumption and encourages us to question and consider the increasingly technology-driven atmospheres that surround our everyday realities. We continue to further and further immerse ourselves into electronic communications. Screens have become such a large part of what we look at that they feel almost invisible. Artists like Oursler remind us not to forget the screen. Question it, enlarge it, minimize, turn around, find another way to tell the story. This episode of Tomorrow is the Problem is produced by ICA Miami's Art and Research Center in partnership with Frequency Media and supported by the Knight Foundation. Our executive producer is Michelle Corey. Our producer is Lizzie Stewart. Our scriptwriter and story editor is Isabel Moncloa Daly. Our script supervisor is Jessica Olivier. Engineering, sound design, and editing by Claire Bidigary Curtis. Visual identity by Julian Andrew K.A.